I'm based, as you heard, at Churchill College in Cambridge, and we've been the beneficiary of your philanthropy for many years, through the excellent students that you've sent to us through the years, several of whom, as you've seen, are here this evening. And I'm sure that Gareth, the current student, will continue this illustrious tradition. Also, very intimidating to stand up here as a public speaker, knowing that there are all these brilliant young speakers and debaters in the room. Probably the one thing that your teachers and coaches didn't tell you when they were talking about Winston Churchill was that actually his school performance was nowhere near as good as yours. We have his school reports in the archive, and a typical example would be conduct has been extremely bad. He cannot be trusted to behave himself anywhere. Okay, well, today I'm going to concentrate on just one small part of Churchill's long relationship with your great country. But it is difficult to think of a more important moment. D-Day, the 6th of June 1944. Operation Overlord, the long-awaited liberation of France and the opening of a second front in northwestern Europe. By any measure, this was a defining moment in the Second World War. And it's one that's now associated, at least in the popular consciousness, with images of largely American troops storming ashore, as depicted in the dramatic opening sequence of the Hollywood blockbuster Saving Private Ryan. Interestingly, it's not a moment normally associated with Winston Churchill, while the huge Canadian land, air and sea contribution is also often overlooked. So hopefully I can do something tonight to address both of those omissions. But let me start with Churchill, because when Churchill has featured as part of the D-Day story, he's often been portrayed negatively. And that's a process that began as early as 1948, with the revelations by General Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander for Overlord, in his published memoir, Crusade in Europe, that Churchill feared the seas would run red with blood. And those comments became the starting point for the 2017 movie Churchill, starring Brian Cox as Winston. Some of you may have seen it. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. And that film opens with the British Prime Minister nervously pacing a British beach and looking out across the channel as in his mind's eye those waves do turn red with blood. And in the film, he's presented as a man who's haunted by the ghosts of his past and who fears a massacre. He's seen it all before at Gallipoli in the First World War, and the script then has him doing all he can to prevent it happening again, showing him working to actively obstruct the D-Day operation with only hours to go, and then taking to his bed when no one will heed him. So how true is that? A related allegation often made against Churchill is that he used his influence to lead his American allies away from Northern Europe into the Mediterranean theatre and Italy, and that he did so in an attempt to preserve the British Empire. So what I want to do in the few minutes allotted to me this evening is to show why I think that picture is far too simplistic. Overlord was a hugely complex proposition, and Churchill faced a myriad of difficult issues in making it happen. And I think we must remember that we see things in the rear-view mirror. We see them with the benefit of hindsight. We know that D-Day was successful. We know that it led inexorably to the end of the war in Europe. But hindsight was not a luxury that was afforded to Churchill, to Roosevelt, to Eisenhower and the other Allied leaders. To them, an amphibious assault on this scale against a heavily fortified coastline was a huge risk. So we need to remember that D-Day was born out of British weakness, not strength. In 1941, Churchill could not contemplate anything more than small-scale commando raids against the French coast. He had to concentrate on the defence of the British homeland and of the empire in the Mediterranean, because a further defeat in either of those theatres would have been terminal for his administration and for Britain's ability and resolve to fight on. And this meant that by early 1942, Churchill had not one but two powerful new allies each coming to the top table with their own agendas and strategies for running and winning the war. The Russians, desperate for help in Eastern Europe. The Americans, keen to defeat Germany in Western Europe as quickly as possible so that they could turn against Japan in the Pacific. Churchill embraced both alliances. Though a veteran anti-communist, he defended his decision to aid the embattled Russians, telling his private secretary, Jock Colville, that if Hitler invaded hell, I would at least make a favourable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. But he was more desperate to secure his American alliance, telling Colville, no lover ever studied every whim of his mistress as I did those of President Roosevelt. But of course, those new alliances came with their own problems. Henceforth, the strategy for planning an offensive war would be a joint one. And as Churchill was fond of saying, the only thing worse than fighting with allies was fighting without them. Incidentally, I don't think he ever actually said that you can always trust the Americans to do the right thing after all other alternatives have been exhausted. But it was at this moment, in the spring of 1942, April 1942, that this important letter from Franklin Roosevelt arrives on Churchill's desk. So most of you won't be able to read this. I'll read it out for you. It's on White House paper, April the 3rd, 11 p.m, and it starts, Dear Winston, what Harry and George Marshall will tell you all about has my heart and mind in it. Your people and mine demand the establishment of a front to draw off pressure on the Russians. And these peoples are wise enough to see that the Russians are today killing more Germans and destroying more equipment than you and I put together. And it has a wonderful ending. Best of luck. Make Harry Hopkins go to bed early and let him obey Dr. Fulton, US Navy, whom I'm sending with him as super nurse with full authority. As ever, FDR. And of course, what Roosevelt is really saying there at the end is don't keep Hopkins up drinking, because Harry's health was notoriously bad. But a wonderful letter from the President, wonderful combination of the grand strategy and the very personal. And the President's letter was designed to open discussions that would lead to the establishment of a new front in Western Europe. And with it came a second document, a secret memorandum entitled Operations in Western Europe. This is the initial and original American military plan, drawn up by Marshall and Eisenhower. And its language could not have been clearer. The United States wanted a cross-channel operation, and they wanted it as quickly as possible. One of the key phrases reads, Western Europe is favoured as the theatre in which to stage the first major offensive by the United States and Great Britain. Through France passes our shortest route to Germany. And the objective outlined in this American plan was to seize the French beaches between Le Havre and Boulogne. But crucially, the plan recognised that it was going to take time to build up American forces in Britain, and it estimates the earliest date for a large-scale D-Day operation as the 1st of April 1943. So here's the Americans in April 1942 saying we want to go into France, but we can't do it on a large scale for a year. For Churchill, of course, this was no moment to risk a return across the Channel. The loss of the American Pacific Fleet had left the British Empire in the east horribly exposed. The British Army had surrendered at Singapore. Hong Kong had fallen. Indeed, when Churchill addressed your Parliament here on the 30th of December 1941, he made a poignant last-minute addition to his speaking notes. You can see a little handwritten addition there. And he's recognising the heroic loss in action of the Royal Rifles of Canada and the Winnipeg Grenadiers. He's added their names in by hand. They'd just been lost at Hong Kong. The Japanese at this point seemed poised to overrun the Indian Ocean and to attack Australia. Worse still, the British are on the retreat again in North Africa, where they're engaged in a seesaw war of attrition with General Rommel. 1942, easy for us to forget now, was a bleak time for Churchill. On the 2nd of July, he had to face down a confidence vote in his administration in the House of Commons. Now, he won it easily, but the very fact that it was held was a sign of mounting disquiet, public and parliamentary disquiet in his administration. And the Labour MP, Anurin Bevan, made the stinging comment that the Prime Minister wins debate after debate and loses battle after battle. Well, the obvious weakness in the US plan was that it was going to take time to build up the required American forces in Britain. In the meantime, the Americans were expecting the British, the Canadians and the other Commonwealth allies to provide the majority of the troops, the naval support and the aerial protection for any operation over France. And with all these other existing commitments, we simply did not have the numbers, even for limited operations in France. So an attack on Vichy, Vichy-held and nominally neutral Morocco and Algeria is dangled as the best alternative. If successful, it will relieve pressure on the British fighting in Egypt and Libya, open up a new front against Rommel, facilitate a decisive end to the North African campaign, and free up British forces for campaigning in France. It will also enable the Allies to practice amphibious operations and landings on a less well-defended shoreline, where untried American troops will not be facing veteran German units. This operation into North Africa, what became Operation Torch, could also take place quickly with overwhelming Allied naval and air superiority. And it's these practical considerations that gradually tilt Roosevelt towards Churchill's preferred strategy. And that process is, of course, helped by continued British weakness in North Africa. There's a dawning realisation by the Americans that they can't allow the British to lose in the Mediterranean. At the same time, the difficulties of a cross-channel operation are horribly illustrated by the disastrous failure of Operation Jubilee, the attempt in August 1942 to attack and temporarily hold the town of Dieppe on the French coast. The story of the ensuing destruction of the Canadian 2nd Division has been told many times and will be familiar to many of you in this audience. The troops are pinned down and badly mauled on the beaches. Even those tanks that make it off the shingle beaches are then destroyed in the town. Losses are high. The town isn't taken. The failed operation is a stark reminder of the difficulties of conducting such an amphibious assault. The British General Alan Brooke sees it as a lesson to the people who are clamouring for an invasion of France. And more recently, Professor Paul Kennedy has written that the psychological lesson of Dieppe was that when the Allies did come ashore in France, they were going to have to be very, very good. So I think it's easy to see why D-Day gets knocked back to 1943. Neither the British nor the Americans believe a large-scale assault on France is feasible. But it's less obvious, perhaps, why the Allied invasion of France doesn't happen until 1944. Momentum in the Mediterranean drives the Allies from North Africa to Sicily and then Italy. But the argument that Lord Dannett and I make in the book is that there were also a number of critical preconditions that had to be met before the Allies could justify the huge risk to men and resources that would be incurred in attacking in France. You have to have a sophisticated level of British and American inter-service cooperation. Canadian forces are already well integrated into the British military structure. But from the top down, from the Prime Minister and the President, it takes time to build the close political and military ties and develop the trust and teamwork that underpins the alliance and makes Overlord possible. And Churchill plays a key role in promoting that alliance, allowing British troops to serve under American commanders and vice versa, and taking steps to support international integration at every level. But that is meaningless unless you also have control of the seas. In his own words, the only thing that ever really frightened Churchill during the war was the U-boat peril. He said, "I was even more anxious about this battle than I had been about the glorious air fight called the Battle of Britain." It takes the first half of 1943 to win the Battle of the Atlantic and establish command of the seas. That's a story for another time. But Churchill uses the convening power of his office to bring together the key authorities through his anti-U-boat committee. And again, the role of the Canadian Navy, your merchant marine and air forces cannot be overemphasised, with the Canadian Navy becoming one of the largest in the world by 1945, but at a huge price in losses. By May 1943, the situation in the Atlantic is in the process of being transformed. But again, it all takes time, just as it takes time to achieve mastery of the air. This involves increasing Allied production while reducing German capacity. A key factor is the relentless bombing of Germany by the Allies. It's a strategy that Churchill endorses from the moment he becomes Prime Minister, one of the few ways in which he can take the fight to the enemy. But again, it takes time. 1942 sees both the arrival of the American 8th Air Force in Britain and the appointment of the single-minded Air Marshal Arthur Harris as head of British Bomber Command. The Casablanca Conference in January 1943 further increases the tempo, unleashing Operation Point Blank against German military and industrial targets. But again, it takes time to wear the enemy down, just as it takes time to build up American, Canadian and other national forces in Britain. And it's not just about the numbers of troops, it's also about putting in place the substantial infrastructure that is needed to sustain them. Preparations had to be put in place to accommodate 1.5 million US servicemen, as well as the Canadian 2nd and 3rd Divisions. Yet perhaps the real turning of the tide was one that Churchill himself chose to largely downplay in his Cold War era history of the Second World War. And that's the smashing of the German army on the Eastern Front in Russia in 1943. It's noticeable that he devotes only 6 pages to the Siege of Stalingrad in Volume 4 and just 3 pages to the Battle of Kursk in Volume 5. Yet those huge land battles, fought by enormous armies, far larger than those deployed by the British and Americans in North Africa or the Mediterranean, accounted for the vast majority of German combat losses between 1941 and 44. By the autumn of 1943, the Red Army has pushed the Wehrmacht back hundreds of miles on a huge front and has retaken Kyiv in the Ukraine. And by 1944, the sheer scale of the Soviet success on the battlefield is, I think, introducing a new element into Allied planning, namely a fear that Germany might collapse completely, leaving the Soviets in possession of large swathes of the continent. And that, of course, was not something that Britain, Canada, America had gone to war for in 1939 or 1941. You also have to have specialist equipment to get your troops onto the beaches. And that's an often overlooked factor in the success of D-Day. The final Overlord operation will involve a staggering 4,126 landing ships and craft, many of them highly specialist. And again, it takes time. It takes time to assemble, to recruit and train the crews and develop the procedures and tactics for using such an armada. Churchill likes scientific innovation. He gives Admiral Mountbatten command of combined operations, and he encourages Mountbatten's team to come up with radical solutions to the logistical difficulties. And this leads to mulberries. And mulberries is the code name for the artificial harbours of concrete and steel that were prefabricated in Britain, towed into position and assembled in situ off the beaches, accompanied by gooseberries, which were breakwaters created by sinking old ships. And again, what you're looking at there is a document that Churchill had framed and put on his study wall at Chartwell, but it's one of the very first memos about the artificial harbours. And you can see at the bottom, Churchill has scrawled various comments in his red pen, which shows the level of interest that he's taking in this new innovation. They have to float up and down with the tide. They have to be properly anchored. They need a drawbridge so that you can get the tanks safely off and unload them. So Churchill took a particular interest in specialist weaponry. He rescued General Percy Hobart from forced retirement, and he encouraged Hobart to develop a range of floating tanks, mine-clearing tanks and road-laying tanks that helped the Allies fight their way off the beaches, avoiding a repeat of Dieppe. Not every project comes to fruition. One Churchill project that didn't was the idea of creating floating aircraft carriers from ice. Now, admittedly, this is ice reinforced with wood pulp, which creates an incredibly strong composite, which was named Pikecrete after its eccentric inventor, Geoffrey Pike. Mountbatten loved Pykrete, and he clearly relished demonstrating the properties of this reinforced ice. He's supposed to have won over Churchill by dropping a block into the Prime Minister's hot bath to show it didn't melt. At the Quebec conference, Mountbatten actually has a block of Pykrete delivered into the room. He then asks one of the American generals to try and attack it with an axe, whereupon the American general immediately jars his arm. Mountbatten's next step was to get the general to fire a revolver at the piece of ice, which, with hindsight, was clearly a very bad mistake, because, of course, what happens is the bullet ricochets around the room, narrowly missing killing the chief of the British Imperial General Staff. So you have to have the specialist equipment. You also have to have the development of officers and troops with real combat experience and high morale. And it's not until after the Battle of El Alamein in November 1942 that the British Army has a large-scale, decisive victory against the Germans. So in my view, it's all of these factors taken together that contribute to the success of D-Day in 1944. Of course, we can never know what would have happened if an assault had been made earlier, but it would certainly have been more difficult. Churchill played a key role in ensuring that all the essential preconditions were met. He also takes a keen interest in the military plans, both the actual plans and the complex deception operations, telling Stalin at Tehran that the truth was so precious that it should always be protected by a bodyguard of lies. And those lies most famously included the creation of a fictional First Army Group in the Thames area under the command of General Patton, fostering the illusion of a second invasion force that might come ashore further north in the Pas-de-Calais area. Churchill certainly supported Eisenhower and Montgomery when they sought to revise and strengthen the operation in early 1944, though he also drove them mad with his constant questioning. He would have said prodding. Where Churchill played an undoubted role was in managing the complex relationship between the civil and military authorities. He had to take the really tough decisions on when to lock down the south coast of England, when to stop travel to neutral Ireland and restrict diplomatic communication from national ambassadors who might leak crucial details of the military build-up. Locked down too early, and he risked weakening British civilian morale and warning the enemy of an imminent operation. Too late, and he might compromise that same military operation. He also had to think about the political consequences in a way that Eisenhower and Montgomery did not. The risk of high French civilian casualties weighed heavily on his mind, and it led him to repeatedly try and seek limits on casualties and mitigation from Eisenhower and the air commanders. He was particularly agitated by the plan to bomb French railway marshalling yards, which were often situated in areas of dense urban population. He feared creating a dull hatred among the French people. And in the short term, he felt that that might stop them rising up in support of the Allied liberation. In the longer term, he feared it might complicate post-war relations and drive France towards communism. Now, of course, his relations with France were further complicated by his difficult relationship with General Charles de Gaulle. Churchill had to lunch with the French leader on Sunday the 4th of June, entertaining de Gaulle's delegation in a railway carriage in the Hampshire countryside where the British Prime Minister had gone to be close to Eisenhower's headquarters. The meeting didn't go well. De Gaulle insisted on being recognised as the legitimate government of France, and that led him to threaten to withhold support and to refuse to broadcast after Eisenhower. According to de Gaulle, Churchill replied angrily, "We are going to liberate Europe, but it is because the Americans are in agreement with us that we do so. This is something you ought to know. Each time we have to choose between Europe and the open sea, we shall always choose the open sea. Each time I have to choose between you and Roosevelt, I shall always choose Roosevelt." And by the evening of the 5th of June, relations between the two men were so bad that Churchill was threatening to send de Gaulle back to Algiers on an aeroplane. Now, clearly this was a conversation that was to have serious ramifications for the post-war Anglo-French relationship, and arguably continues to echo today. The pressures were clearly immense. Churchill disliked the period of waiting and preparation immediately before the invasion. He was someone who liked to be at the centre of unfolding events, not waiting on them. And on the night before D-Day, he dined alone with Clementine. And afterwards, he told her, "Do you realise that by the time you wake up in the morning, 20,000 men may have been killed?" That's 81 years ago this evening. And it would be wrong to think that this streak of pessimism was a lonely manifestation of Churchill's black dog. It wasn't. Strip away the layers of hindsight and you see that it's shared by almost all the senior Allied commanders. Admiral Ramsay, the often forgotten architect of the naval planning, Operation Neptune, wrote in his diary for the 5th of June 1944, "I'm under no delusions as to the risks involved in this most difficult of all operations and the critical period around H-hour when, if initial flights are held up, success will be in the balance." And Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, the chief of the British Imperial General Staff, goes even further in his private journal of the same day, 5th of June, 81 years ago today, writing, "I'm very uneasy about the whole operation. At the worst, it may well be the most ghastly disaster of the whole war. I wish to God it was safely over." And even the Supreme Commander, General Eisenhower, after giving that momentous order to go, seizing the break in the weather, retired to write and seal a letter to be opened in the event of failure that night, accepting personal responsibility on withdrawing the troops from the beachheads. And the failure of Overlord would have meant the failure of everything that Churchill and Eisenhower had worked towards. This was a make or break moment with all the eggs in one basket, and therefore I don't think it is surprising that they were worried. But let's go back to that movie, Churchill, in 2017. How did Churchill cope with that worry? Did he try and obstruct the operation? Did he take to his bed? Well, what he actually decided was that he wanted to accompany the invasion force himself. And he asked Admiral Ramsay to draw up the plans that would have made that possible. It was an order, so Ramsay had to do it, and those plans would have seen the British Prime Minister boarding HMS Belfast on D-1 before transferring to a destroyer for a short tour of the beaches on D-Day itself. Now, as you can imagine, that's not popular with the military commanders. The last thing that any of them want is the added burden and responsibility of having Churchill anywhere near the action on the day itself. And it's clearly not where he should be. He should be in London, dealing with the political aftermath. Eisenhower tries to talk Churchill out of it. Churchill simply bats it away and says the Supreme Commander has no control over who goes on one of His Majesty's warships. So Churchill sticks to his guns. Constitutionally, of course, there's only one person who can order him not to go, and that is the King. And even then, it takes two very personal, handwritten appeals from King George VI. The first one, sent on the 31st of May 1944, the second as late as the 2nd of June, before Churchill grudgingly concedes to His Majesty's wishes and indeed commands, protesting that I ought to be allowed to go where I consider it necessary to the discharge of my duty. And later he reflected that a man who has to play an effective part in taking, with the highest responsibility, grave and terrible decisions of war, may need the refreshment of adventure. He may need also the comfort that when sending so many others to their death, he may share in a small way their risks. Churchill needed the release of action, and he gets it. He's finally able to inspect the Normandy beachhead on the 12th of June, D-Day +6. And here he would have been able to see for himself the fruits of the success of the Canadian 3rd Division, whose landing on Juno Beach on the 6th of June laid to rest the ghosts of Dieppe. It must have taken incredible bravery to come ashore under enemy fire, and certain units undoubtedly took casualties, though overall, of course, they were much lower than what Churchill had feared. That success, I would argue, was only possible because all of the essential preconditions for the operation had been met. The enemy was weaker, the attack was not expected, the air and naval support was in place, the technology worked. So what can we conclude about Churchill and D-Day? Yes, he was undoubtedly influenced by the First World War and a desire to avoid a repeat of the huge bloodshed of the trench stalemate in France, which would have been catastrophic for the country and almost certainly fatal to his own administration. Yes, he was determined to preserve the British Empire. Any British Prime Minister in World War II would have been forced to think about imperial defence. But Churchill was particularly driven by a desire not to preside over the Empire's liquidation. He was also becoming increasingly worried about Soviet domination of the Balkans. The pending post-war settlement was certainly a factor in his desire to keep fighting in Italy, even after the final decision had been taken to attack in France. And it explains why at times he resented what he called the tyranny of overlord. Yet for all of this, he regarded the relationship with the United States and the commitment to D-Day as the keystone arch of Anglo-American cooperation, and Canada, as you heard, as the linchpin in that relationship. All the major decisions were debated with Roosevelt and the combined chiefs of staff. They were taken for sound strategic reasons. Operations in North Africa and Sicily took on their own momentum and further delayed D-Day, but they were launched because the preconditions for an assault on Normandy had not yet been met, because the risks of a frontal assault in France were deemed too high, and because to do nothing while preparing to attack France was politically and militarily unacceptable. The Battle of the Atlantic had to be won, mastery of the skies obtained, the enemy had to be isolated and weakened. On D-Day itself, Churchill, in spite of his best efforts to get himself a front row seat on board a British ship, had to wait for news of the battle in London. It's true that he didn't have the same reserves of energy as in 1940, but he wasn't a nervous wreck as the movie Churchill seeks to portray him. The weeks leading up to Overlord see him taking an active interest in all aspects of the operation, using his convening power to ensure that production targets are met and security is being maintained. Though often portrayed as a warmonger, one of Winston's consistent concerns in cabinet meetings prior to the invasion was to minimise Allied military and French civilian casualties. Yes, he drove the War Cabinet and the Chiefs of Staff to distraction, complaining about the number of support vehicles versus frontline troops, railing against the machinations of de Gaulle, opposing plans to bomb French railway marshalling yards. But he did so out of a concern to reduce losses and ensure success. Surely that was his job. 81 years ago today, your countrymen were liberating Italy and preparing to free France. If Churchill were here, I have no doubt he would be saluting them. Thank you.